Okay, you
Ready
have
to go?
you have the usual protections so we don't get bombed or anything.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
Good.
Um, so yeah, I just want to welcome everyone to the Goethe-Institut's um, uh, July book event with Pierre Joris and Nicholas Hauck. Pierre is a poet and translator of numerous works, um, including the works of Paul Celan. He's also translated numerous authors into both English and French, including Tristan Tzara, Rainer Maria Rilke, Jean-Pierre Dupré, Habib Tengour, Maurice Blanchot, and many others. So we're excited to have him here this evening to discuss Paul Celan and issues around translation, and with Nicholas Hauck, who is a writer, translator, and scholar. He works on the 20th and 21st century French and English poetry and poetics, and thinks about translation as an embodied language performance. And he teaches at Brock University. So without further ado, I will give it over to Pierre, who's going to, I believe, kick this off with reading one of Paul Celan's poems, and Nicholas will then come and take it from there. So take it away, and thank you both very much for being here.
Thank you, Carter.
Thank you, Carter.
What I want to do is I'll read my translation of what is a really well-known poem of Celan's late poem called Tottenauberg, and it is the poem that deals with Celan's meeting with Heidegger. And it is an interesting poem to talk about translation because there are many translations of it, and very often for very specific purposes, which made for different approaches to the translation. So I will read my translation, and then we can talk about this and about anything else in relation to Celan and translation. Tottenauberg, Arnica, eyebright, the draught from the well with the star die on top. In the Hütte, written in the book, whose name did it record before mine? In this book, the line about a hope today for a thinker's word to come in the heart. Forest sword, unleveled, orchids and orchids singly, crudeness later while driving, clearly. He who drives us, the man, he who also hears it, the half-trod log trails on the high moor, humidity much. That's the poem. Nick, do you hear any of the traffic from outside, from my place here? I can close the window if that comes through.
I mean, I can hear traffic. I'm not sure if it's from my place or your place or Carter's, but I don't think it's too much of a disturbance on my end.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pierre, for that reading. Did you want to start out and talk a bit about the poem, or should we get into some questions right away?
Okay. I can say a few things about the poem in the sense that, it is that well-known poem, especially in France, where 3 or 4 philosophers wrote essays about it. You could now put together probably about 2 books worth of writing about this specific poem, because in France it became so famous immediately because of France's great like for Heidegger, despite the Heideggerian problems with fascism. And it is exactly in that moment, in the late 80s, when a number of people in France wrote books about Heidegger being a fascist, that the question about his poem came back up from various translations, et cetera, et cetera. So it was, and it was roughly then, I translated it in 88, I think. Voila. Maybe you take it away there.
Yeah, I guess my initial question to you would be then, given the number of other translations available in French and English, etc. Why? I mean, it applies to this poem in particular, but to all of Celan's work that you've done. What did you translate differently, or how did you approach the translation of this poem in particular compared to other translations that have been done in the past? I mean, you've written about this a bit in your essays on this poem in particular, but I'm wondering if maybe you could point out one or two places in your translation that have differed significantly from others, and perhaps why.
Well, this comes about 2/3 of the way through, no, halfway through my work on Celan, which I started in '68. So we are now in the late '80s, and I'm translating the book Lichtzwang, Light Duress, which has this poem in. So what I started learning in the late '60s on the complexity of late Celan and the way we approach translating him, which comes, I think, or has to come, should come from an understanding that the late work is work that I would consider serial majorly. That is, you don't have individual complete poems. Things lie there as if they were. Some have titles, some don't. But from Atemwende, Breath Turn onward, Celan really composes books in a way, divided into sections. And there is no longer that sense of the early poems, be it the Todesfuge or Engführung, major single works. There is a different kind of ring. And that changes one's approach to translating him. You basically look, you're very conscious of how poems repeat certain words or certain themes or change them. For example, in this poem, there is the second part of the flora, which is orchis and orchis. And as soon as you hear this, in the poem, of course, it rhymes with the very different flowers from the first line, Arnica, Augentrost, Eyebright, and then later you have orchis and orchis. But that orchis also links to several other poems inside of Celan's work. And in German, that orchis is also called Knabenkraut, that is boy's weed, because the orchis has a root that is shaped as like a testicle. So the orchis here, for example, and it's interesting to look at it there, you have orchis and orchis singly. So there are two men who are clearly there walking next to each other, but separated by and, you know.
The conjunction, right? Yeah.
Insistingly, they are singly, right? At the end, it says singly. Whereas, if you now go back to the first line, you have Arnica and Eyebright. You have two healing plants separated by a comma, kind of, you know, juxtaposed in that sense. And if you look at Augentrost, you can also find Augentrost in very early poems of Celan. And that is always, you know, there's no underline rhymes in a Celan poem or none in the major work, but there are image rhymes throughout the work here. And those rhymes are, of course, important, even in the sense that in this poem, you don't have metaphorical flowers, les fleurs de tarbes, like the poetic metaphors. You know, you have very specific. Celan knew, and that is something you learn throughout looking at the work, studying it. Knew his botany extremely well. So Arnica and Eyebright are two healing plants, very specific. What in translation there you lose immediately. In English, in German, it's Arnica Augentrost. So you have two capital A's that
Right.
start off the poem. And then later, half the way through, or nearly 2/3 of the way through the poem, you have two small O's, orchis and orchis, right? And obviously there is a rhyme that goes on there between the two healing plants, and then the two males walking separately, out there.
So, yeah. So I get. I'm curious about these the botanical aspect, especially in this poem, because you've said that the two orchids separated by the conjunction, and then sort of the singularity emphasized with the last word of that line, as a kind of aborted relationship or aborted encounter between Celan and Heidegger in the hut. And I'm wondering, does that kind of play into both Celan's German and the way you approach the translation and the text, in this idea of a kind of impossibility or a separation that must remain? Is that something that plays into translation? I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is there something like an untranslatability, not that I believe in untranslatability, but this separation of language perhaps hints at that at the same time as we translate.
Yes, no, there are obviously, I mean, you see there, I can reproduce the A rhyme, Arnica, Eyebright.
Right. Yeah.
I'm happy to get it with orchis, and I was even tempted of using capital O's to make that, very strong, but then thought that would be overdoing it.
Sure.
I have later on in the last book, in translating the title Die Niemandsrose, I decided that at that point you couldn't any longer say the no one's rose.
Yeah.
Right? Because it had become such a concept, the term, and you hear it like that. Niemandsrose is a Celan word at this point, and it's not three words. But putting them together, no one's rose in one word, if it has capital N, O-O-N, noon, you always have noon. So playing with it, I came up with no one's rose in one word, but with three capitals in it, three subwords capitalized. And if somebody would bitch at me for doing that liberty, I would say, hey, go to that letter where Celan writes how he tried to explain that title to his son into French, and he wrote it as La Rose Nulle, Rose Nulle in one word with a capital N.
With capital N in the middle.
On the null. So, wow, Celan did it. I can do it too.
Sure,
So,
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this question of titles, and I want to ask you about the titles of the two collections, The Memory Rose into Threshold Speech, and then Breath Turn into Timestead. And I guess a couple of questions about it. I like the into in between the two title words that suggests a progression and a movement. But then also there's the division between the early and the late. So a definite shift, which I think you've said before about is the meridian speech for Celan is really where he kind of expresses his poetics and is a monumental shift in his work. But I'm curious, you started with the late and then went to the early. So I'm wondering how the progression that's suggested in the titles into and the whole progression of Celan's work, how that fits in with your own practice as a translator, starting with the late and then moving backwards, or was that a conscious choice, or how did you?
Oh yeah, it was very conscious. I mean, I came to Celan in high school. When I was 14, 15, my German teacher in Luxembourg, where I grew up, brought in a peripatetic reader who read us a range of contemporary poetry. And, there was the stuff you sit around, you say, oh yeah, that's interesting, etc. And then all of a sudden he read the Todesfuge. And the Todesfuge just blew me away. Something happened, And I realized there's a use of language here that has
Right.
nothing to do with the use that I make of it daily or with
Yeah.
what we were taught was literature, you know. This
Yes.
was poetry. This was something of an absolute power.
Yeah.
And that turned me to poetry from then on. I, you know, came to it slowly. I went to Paris to study medicine.
Huh.
In a way,
Okay.
exactly what Celan had done going to Tours to study medicine. He
Yeah,
could
yeah.
not go back after a year because of the war and horrible things. I had the freedom at one moment to just drop out. This is the middle 60s, and decide that I'm going to be a poet, right? And to go to America. Now, I'd been reading Celan. I bought the books as
Yeah.
that I could get my hands on. And in September 67, when I left for New York, the new book, Atemwende, had just come out and I bought it. And that late poetry immediately seemed to me to correspond to what my sense of very contemporary poetry had to be.
Right. Okay.
So when I came here, I came to New York, I went to Bard College, and the next year I had to decide on a dissertation. And I decided to translate Celan, that book,
Has your dissertation worked?
as my BA dissertation.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that Celan was the most incredible contemporary writing that I had come across. Way back, I decided to write in English because I didn't want to write in French, because I didn't think there was anything interesting happening in French. I couldn't really write in German because German poetry and Germany had a totally different questioning to deal with in the 50s into the 60s than I did. But I had discovered the beats. I discovered American poetry. Wow, this was the great thing. I couldn't write in my Mamalaschen in Luxembourgish because I didn't know how to. And, you know, why would you want to do that? So my fourth language, English, was the one I picked.
Yeah.
What was very interesting is that in that first semester at Bard, the poet Robert Kelly, who had translated a bit of Celan for Sid Corman's magazine, brought me into American poetry, and I discovered the San Francisco poets, not the Beats, but Duncan, Blazer, Spicer, and that notion of the serial poem that Spicer evolved. And I saw that immediately. I said, wow, in Europe, the one who's doing it is Celan. Those late books become serial poems. So I had a poetics that I immediately, from the Americans, I learned about, you know, I could see how this was also what Celan in an other way, but similarly was doing. So to me, it was important to translate that late work that was totally alive. And the next year I got the first book that came out after his death in 70 and so on. I got all those books and I continued translating the late work. And I did that all the way till it was done. I couldn't get it published. That's a different story because of rights questions and so on. And eventually, you know, in the 80s, when I got moved back to the US, and in the early 90s, the books came out. I had at that moment no desire to translate the early work. But in 13, when I gave the complete late work to Farrar Straus, Johnson Galassi said, why don't you also translate the early work? And I immediately said, oh, no, I got other stuff to do, right? But of course, that worked on me. And as I had done these other translations of his, I thought, well, if I did the early work, I would have done all of Celan. So at about 15, I decided, 6 years ago, I decided to do this with the deadline of the centenary, i.e. last year. It had to be done at the end of 19, so they could bring the book out in the middle of 20. So I came late to the early work, I mean, in terms of translating it. And it was a different adventure because there is a very different sense to the poetics of it. So, and you can see that the way what I did with the titles, right? Breath Turn is one title, Into Timestat is another. So it's one, you know, but Memory Rose into Threshold
Speech. Yeah.
You have 4 words, and and into, because the early titles are still multiple words, von Schwelle to Schwelle, except for, of course, the one I translated, the Niemandsrose.
So what I guess my question would be a sort of a two-pronged question. I wonder if you could speak a bit about the differences in the translation approach to the early work and the late work. I mean, the early work, as you've said, is much more, there's a lot of metaphor and imagery and sort of, more sort of poetic forms there, but the later work is much more sort of fusional and transformative. And so I'm wondering, as a translator, the approach to that, and then a sort of follow-up question, how does the translation affect your work as a poet? Like, what is the overlap, or is there an overlap or conversation between the two practices? Yeah. And do you see that difference when you were translating the early and the late, if that's
the early work was the late work was much more difficult to do, but I was much younger and discovering poetics and writing myself into what would be my writing life. And so I could be very much more daring. I could do anything. There was, I could play, I could experiment with translation. And I did a fair amount of that. There was stuff that never got shown in a way where I play with homophonic versions, where I play, in all kind of ways, playing with it, while knowing the absolute seriousness of the endeavor and the work. It took me those many years. So when I come 6 years ago to the early work, there's a lot of work, but it feels much easier, it feels like, oh, okay, I don't need to come up with completely complex words, or if I need to put words together, we have done this already. So this is no longer, I remember the first reviews or takes on my translations of the late work. The question, you can't do that in English. It may work in German doing those long words, verschachtete words, but in English, it doesn't sound natural. And it took me early on a while, I suddenly realized and began saying that Celan does not sound natural to a German speaker.
Right.
It is an invented language, and Celan is very clear about that. Once I had discovered and come clear in my own head about the fact that Celan is doing something to German. That is, he is rebuilding German, he's cleaning it up, he is reformulating it, he's making a new language. He's translating into German.
Yeah.
So then I could translate into English, much more easily. And in that sense, the early poems are a bit more difficult, because then you come, in a few of them, I came across the same problems anybody comes across translating Rilke, right? Because you try to keep the music going, but the syntax or the vocabulary doesn't work that way. And so you come into odd moments where you have to make decisions that I didn't need to do with the late work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, thank you. That was wonderful. So I think of like Walter Benjamin's translation as an encounter between languages, where both languages are transformed. And I like this, what you said about Celan translating German in his own German. And so just to come back to it, when you write as a poet, do you think of that as a form of translation as well? The same, yes, in a sense? Yeah.
In a sense, remember, as I said earlier, I write in my fourth language.
Right.
So I always write in a language that I have to remind myself at some point that all languages are foreign languages. We don't have a native language. That is an invention, language, what comes are electric and physiological things that happen in our brains and in our bodies. And then we come up with a kind of artificial thing that is language. And that's why so many languages, because, you know, obviously the words don't stick to the objects, right? That's why we can have 25 different words for cat in different languages, right? So language is a completely artificial thing and is a translation. So I've always, and I've written on that in essays that you may or may not have seen, you know, where I just speak to the fact that we always in, you know, I often define the poem as, the poem is a complex. It goes from the first notes in the notebook, handwritten, to the first typed up version, to the first magazine published version. But the poem is very different from when it gets into the first book. You have a little book, you know, where it comes out in little context, then you get a selected, plus the poem is also all the sums of the readings that the poet gives it, and then all the translations into other languages. So that, you know, the poem, if you want to use the that wonderful Louis Zukowski definition of the poem as an integral, right? From speech to music. Here you can have an integral from, you know, from the oral brain fart of the first thing that came to the most complex performance of it, right? So that is the poem. Therefore, as a translator, you only translate one possible version of a poem, right? One instantiation of it, not in any way the complete poem. Because the poem is different. If I read today the poem that blew me away in 1959, the Todesfuge, when I heard it, I translated that 3 years ago. It was a different poem for me because of my life since then, because of everything that had happened to the poetry, to Celan. And one discovers new things. I had finished that translation. I'd handed it in, and I was in Paris, and I was having lunch with Bertrand Badiou and Eric Celan. And Bertrand, who's kind of the man who takes care of the Celan stuff in Paris and helps Eric with that too, he said, did you know that that word, der Mann greift nach dem Eisen, the man goes for the rod, you know, the iron rod in the belt. That Eisen there, somebody had just discovered, was really from Celan something from his reading of Karl May, of those, you know, those juvenile stories where das Eisen is a reference to revolver, right? Pull a gun, pull a revolver, right? So the book was already going to print when I quickly sent a note saying, can you change that iron rod to gun, you know? So, you know, and next time, the version I just read of that poem.
The one you just,
in it, what is the word? I realized that I changed, meanwhile, one word in that poem, and that in the way it is printed, I can't even see it now, but I noticed it when I was reading it.
When you're reading.
Look, yes, I have changed one word in here already.
So I want to get back to this really interesting thing you said about translation, how, you know, Celan sort of translated into his own German, and it makes me think of the other in translation, because translation is, you know, heading towards another language, maybe not necessarily the other, capital O, but there's an otherness that I think is inherent to translation. And then that also, I think, implies a kind of ethics. And so the question here maybe is like, who do we translate for? Why do we translate? And do we have to think about the ethical stakes when we're translating? Certain texts probably have a little bit more ethical weight than others, maybe not. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that, especially when, you know, we talked about German and contemporary issues around translation, and even if we want to talk about language of colonizer, colonized, things like that. So a very broad question.
Yeah, I think one works always with one sense of the politics of, you know, what needs to be done. after I brought I did the Fergendienst, the ferrying Celan over to America, which I think was a job to be done that needed to be done in terms of a certain way, tightening up my generation's bad imitations of beat poetry, giving a different sense. There is an ethical thing involved in saying, hey, look at what this man is doing and why he's doing it and what Celan's poetry is about, After that, for example, given that I went to teach in North Africa and was in Algeria, I also thought that translating the need to bring a lot of work from third, whatever you want to call it, from the other worlds, always with an S, over into it. And I mean, you can see that very well also with the work I did together with my compadre, Jerry Rothenberg, when we did the poems for the Millennium Anthologies. The whole point there is to bring the work from other parts of the world that otherwise is not visible here, bring it into visibility. So there is a very strong, you want to call it ideological, I don't care. It just seems to me that it is a necessary thing to, as a translator, that is essentially what you're doing. You're saying, hey, you haven't seen this. And you can't see it because you don't have the language. So I'm bringing it over into that language so that you can have a look at it here. So that is absolutely involved. Are there things that one should not translate? I don't think so. There are things that you want to could be translated. Let's take an absolute case. Should there be a good English version of Mein Kampf? Right. Yes, I don't want to burn any book. I don't think as soon as you decide to burn one book, it won't stop. You can burn any number, right? So that's off. Now, Mein Kampf, however, is a book that would need, from the translator, a historical setting that is a whole set of explanations of writing around. The same way, then I have 240 pages of notes to a volume, a book of as nasty, vicious, and evil a book as Eis or Hitler or whatever it is, would need that kind of framing, but it should be available. Right. You can't make something written unwritten.
Yeah.
And so the only thing you can do with it is that.
Annotate it, comment it, give it a context. Yeah. That's, I like that idea. The larger sort of the larger political questions of the translator. I'm also wondering, when we get down to the act itself, so the individual translator or the choice in words, is there a politics there as well, in a sense of, we have word choices as translators. You talk about a kind of a semantic stratification, looking for the etymology of words in the act of translating. And then some translators, I'm not going to say that they're lazy, but they look more globally at a text when translating. And so I'm wondering what kind of ethics does that exist too? Like, so at the level of the individual word, a semantic kind of ethics, and perhaps a more global textual ethics.
Probably because I spent so much time in my life translating Celan.
Right. Okay.
The absolute need, the verticality of Celan. This poem that we read.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to read my essay, I'll show in there how a translation that was made from an essay that Gadama wrote about his old teacher, Heidegger, and saying how great Heidegger was. And he was so great that even a Jewish poet like Celan would come to him and write a poem for him showing how great he is. So the translator of that specific Gadama book translated this poem also. And the poem comes out as a great poem appraising, being nice to Heidegger, when the German poem, if you read it, and if you read it the way I read it, that is in that vertical etymological sense,
Yeah.
very clearly says the opposite of that,
Right.
So you can just take the word Hütte, which
Yep.
in my translation, I leave as Hütte, because Heidegger's Hütte is that very specific place, and he doesn't translate as hut or as cottage, as that other translator did it, because the cottage sets up the English romantic poets sing. We go to the cottage, and then we go out to the forest meadow, to the, and frolic. The poets and the sheep and the philosophers frolic in the sun in the afternoon, right? That's not the poem. It's not a meadow. That is where the IE gets changed into A in the expression. Waldwiesen becomes Waldvasen. And if you want to be just poetic, you say, oh, yeah, that is a rhyme with the original flowers, Arnika, Aufros, Waldvasen. But then if you look at what the vase is, you go into a totally different level of meaning in there. So that verticality is, Vasen leads, as I say in the essay, eventually to the, via French, to the Latin word fasces, i.e. the bundle with rods with the X in the middle, the symbol of fascism. So that is in the middle of the poem. And if you translate that as the meadow, the meadow in the forest, no, it's not a meadow, the Vasen, right?
Right.
Also,
do you think that those kinds of translations, and all translations, your translations, the other translations of Celan, are historically contingent, or is it the approach of the translator in particular? There are other examples of poets who have been translated, like Baudelaire, for example, has been translated so many times, and one can look at the different translations and almost, in a way, trace the kind of poetic movements based on when the translation was done. But I'm wondering if your vertical etymological in-depth look at the words in the act of translating is a way of avoiding that historical contingency, or is it just something that you feel necessary when you're translating Celan? And is it necessary for other poets, or is it particular to Celan's work?
I don't think it tries to avoid, or it can avoid, historical contingency. Okay, I translate Celan when I begin doing it when Celan is still alive, right? And then go afterwards, and I've done it for 50 years now. So it's a half century post Celan that I'm doing. In 50 years, I think he should be translated again.
Okay, yes.
Absolutely. Now, I would like mine and Hamburger's translations to stay available, because
I think we all would. Yes.
As I said, you want them, you want the number of translations available. If you read Baudelaire, you don't want just one. If you don't have French, you want 3 or 4 English translations, because then you can begin to make some kind of sense out of something that's happening. I mean, there are some Celan translations that I would rather they wouldn't be reprinted, because to my mind they are so absolutely atrocious in terms of what they're doing, a disfiguring, a misuse of Celan. But that's a different question. Again, as I said earlier, by defining the poem as all those different instances, all the translations of a poem come into this too. But that's, it's difficult to say. In my sense, all writing is translation. And in a way that there is no original. Even my original poems are not originals, are always already translations. So you can look at them as at one moment fixed, but the same person reading them 20 years hence will read a different poem, because that person is different and the poem is in a different place, in a different, my sense would be that in my home country, in Luxembourg, my poems are read differently than they are read here. There is,
I would probably, yeah.
you
I
know,
think that's pretty fair. Yeah.
you know, there's all of that comes in, and I know that from writing in my own, in my own writing, there is
Mhm.
that sense of the temporal and local contingency. I'm writing this now here, and it will sound totally different. And I'm often being translated into, it will sound different in a different language, in a different place. So it is complex. It is, but it adds. It's like, look at Celan's translation of Shakespeare's sonnets. And Peter Sondy has a beautiful essay where he takes one of those sonnets and he looks in detail on two of the last lines. And Celan's gorgeous translation does, however, an interesting little metaphysical addition so that you can tell, this is no longer tout à fait Shakespeare, who in his 1603 or whenever he wrote it, mind meant this. Celan means that, and this little other thing that comes in by simply the choice of the syntactical position of two words, right? So that, and that's great. It pushes forward what we're doing, what we're thinking. You have to do that.
And I guess, would you say that would be Celan's sort of, I mean, it is his translation, but it's also Celan, inserting himself in, I don't want to use the word inserting himself into the text because that sounds a bit, there's a violence there to it, but he is adding something, as you said. And so again, I think that, does that blur the line between creation and translation, or what do we say now? Transcreation is something that's become,
I would say so. You always try to be faithful to the original. You want to be as faithful as possible. But of course you cannot be, because you're moving it into another language at another time, in a different mode. So there is no way that you can say the same thing. There is a different sound already to it, right? Because you're writing a different language. So you will try, but no matter how hard you try, change happens. There is no way of stopping that change. So if you are very good, like Celan was, as good a translator as a poet, or as good of a poet as a translator, those things feed on each other. And there are some poets I don't have Russian, so I read some of the poets that he has translated. I read only in Celan's translations, because they seem to me by far the best that I have seen. Anyway, that's
so the objectivity of the translator is not possible. No. Good. Well, yeah, we agree on that. That's great. I'm going to see if there are any questions from the participants here. I know we have one from Ami already. I'll just read it out. How can we read compound arranged words such as dwarf birch balm in the Muscle Heap poem? Are they neologisms? They seem to function like smaller poems inside of the poems, like ancient particles that have been arranged into the poems like fossils. Are they points of entry or eternal departures? How do you treat and translate these words differently from other compound words like homeland or firestone? So there's a lot going on there. I can repeat a few if you want, but
I think it answers its own question very well.
Okay.
Yeah, of course you do. You do all that. Now, what is interesting in Celan's compounds, and you had to realize that, you come to him and you find these strange words put together, and you wonder, and you say, did Celan create that compound, or is that a word? And what happens is that very often you think that this is a natural word, And it is not. Ceylon made it. But very often you think this is a Ceylon compound, but if you look deep into the language, you will realize that it existed already in the language as a compound. So he himself plays, and we, reading him, have to, basically it's a matter of being on your toes, right?
Mm.
And it's that playfulness, that care that you have to bring. You can't take anything for granted. You have to look at everything there is. That's why when Ceylon gets translated, as it was by some, when all those compounds are iron, well, in English we don't use those compounds, so let's
Right.
make little things,
Yeah.
And then you have something that reads like a good American poem, like William Carlos Williams type easy syntax prose. If you know anything about Ceylon, you know that that is wrong. You know that that has destroyed Ceylon, because for a German reader, Ceylon is, as I think I've said that already, is very difficult. It is not the language spoken, right? I usually say this in relation to reviews. When a review speaks of a translation and says, this reads as if it was written in American, that's a bad translation. A translation, you have to hear that this is translated. That is, you have to be able, you have to turn around continuously, say, oh yeah, this is a translation. What is happening here?
Mm.
My favorite line of that is Hölderlin, when he speaks of translating the Sophocles, the Greeks, into German. He says, I need to write Greek in German. And I feel
to feel it.
I need to write German in English to get Ceylon over. People should, one, know this is a translation. Two, this is what Ceylon does. This is how his language functions. So I don't know if that answers the question very much. You have it right in front of you. Is there something that I should go more into?
I think so. No, it was about the neologisms. I mean, I like, this is a question from Ami. I like the way she puts, are the ancient particles that have been arranged into the poems like fossils? I mean, it's a great line in itself.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially as his geological knowledge.
Sure.
And the creation of a new world, which is what he's trying to do, where geology plays a major role as, something solid left over, given that everything melts, everything solid has melted into thin air, to quote somebody else, Ceylon tries to build solid things, caustic rock and so on, is there all the time. So yes.
That's great. There's another question here from Ricky, and it's about affect. He asks, how do you account for affect in the physical sense between the different languages in your translation of Ceylon? So I guess the difference between affect in German and affect in English.
I don't know. I have to, what do you mean exactly by affect in language? Affect.
I'll read out the question. So how do you account for affect in the physical sense between the different languages in your translation of Ceylon?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I can't really, in a way, speak to that. I wouldn't know how to define affect, or give me an example of what.
Ricky, if you're there, do you have can you answer Pierre in a way, define affect a bit more if you can? If not, Carter, would you like to allow Ricky to speak quickly, or Ricky in the chat perhaps?
I think what I was talking about was emotional affect, psychical affect.
It's difficult to say. I mean, how Ceylon's emotion in the poems are Ceylon's emotions, and they come from historical, biographical basis of it. And how does that work in the translation? It's difficult to you can only be as literal as you can, and then maybe again one has to know. For example, I don't think necessarily a German reader will know what the emotional affect of the word Schnee, snow, is with Ceylon, right? But he will always translate as snow, right? Schnee is snow. Now, for an English reader, snow may have an effective value. For each one, it has a different one depending on where you are in the world, depending on what your relation with snow is. So the only way you can actually find out more about that, and that is why I built in these relatively huge note sections at the end of the book, you know, based on the absolutely wonderful work that the German edition does in that. For example, it's useful to know that for Ceylon, snow is always an area of pain because his mother was killed during the snowy months. So snow is always associated with mourning and death, right? Now, there is no way I can translate that at the level of the word snow. I can only inform the reader in some way that in Ceylon's universe, you know, snow associates mainly, you know, with pain and death. Now you can find that out as you read Ceylon. You say, what happens in the snow, you know, in Ceylon, what, you know, and you'll notice that he's not going skiing or not, you know, playing in the snow, but that snow represents a landscape that's eerie, even if you don't know exactly what the effective value is, although it clearly is not a simple, pleasant, you know, oh, look, it snowed, let's go out and play. You know, it's something else that, you know, and, you know, that important there is that you can't know a poet as complex as Ceylon unless you spend a lot of time with the work across a wide expanse of the work. You know, it's very difficult to take a couple poems and think that, oh wow, these poems, you know, explain Ceylon to me, or I know now what Ceylon is about. You know, even if you take, everybody knows the Todesfuge, right? But the Todesfuge is a poem that is totally visible on the surface as to what it does. But Ceylon exactly then refused that obviousness and decided not to even reprint the poem, because you can also misread that poem. That poem was misread by a critic who said, this is great fantasy, great surreal imagery that has no relation to reality. It turns out that critic, Hans Egon Holthusen, had been an SS man during World War II. So, you know, it was important to him to make this thing disappear, right? The truth of it. But there you are. So you really have to go into the work. The work is not a poem. The work is the life's work of the writer. And you have to learn as much as you can about the width of the work, you know. I don't know. That's answers what you said. Okay, great.
Thanks, Ricky. I guess just to follow up, Pierre, on that question, getting back to the kind of the translator and how you want to make the translation feel like a translation, let the reader know that it's a translation. So have, you know, the traces, or however we want to put it, of the German and the English, for example, or in the case of Polderlin. And I guess, is that a way perhaps to transmit or carry over or make sure that affect remains? I mean, I'm thinking of Celan's sort of sorrow and the sort of darkness in his work. And I think, you do have that in there, and you've managed to show it. Whereas, as you just said, some examples or some translations try to erase it, or sort of layer that over with other kind of poetic devices. So I'm wondering, is that a way of maintaining or sort of providing a kind of honesty to the work?
For motorcycles racing by. But
okay,
yes, I think for me in Celan, the way to do that was to stay as close to Celan's mode of writing as possible. That is, making him more readable would have exactly lost that tension.
Sure. Yeah.
And therefore, even if the poem, given that it is translated and that is a very complex act that is superimposed, on what is already a complex act, if a poem reads better in the translation or easier, it's a bad translation, and it ruins the poem. A translation merely needs to read more difficult, with more difficulty, because you can have the same music playing. So for me, what was important was, given the ability of German to compress syntax, for Celan to do poems. That poem we read, the Totenberg poem, right, is one sentence. It opens up, there are commas, and then there is a final period, right? So there is that, but it goes down the page, like that. And you have to reproduce that kind of tightness, even if stylistically, or if you want syntactically, you have to do some violence to the English, or to the language you translate it into. I mean, I always feel sorry for the people who translate Celan into French, because what you can do, that German syntactical ability of creating those compounds and moving syntactically that fast down, in English, because we are a Germanic language in that sense, they're cousins, you can imitate that, you can do it. It may be more difficult. So in French, it's impossible. I always say a Celan poem is like a corkscrew driven into the earth from top, like that. When in German, if you translate it into French, it becomes a Christmas tree with all the sub clauses and the little sentences that that come out. So it really is very, very difficult in some languages.
Great. Yeah. That's great. The corkscrew and the Christmas tree for French and German. Yeah. That's lovely. Thank you very much, Pierre. So what's next now that you've completed the monumental Celan? Any projects that we can look forward to in the near future?
At this point, no translation projects. I have, as I said earlier, I was not necessarily going to do the early work. So I put my work a bit on hold for the last 5 years. And so I have 3. I have a book that involves translation, but it's a reader I would like, rather than do another selected poems. I want to do a book that combines poems, essays, and translations. The 3 modes really that I've used, for half a century, and build a book. It doesn't have to be complete essays. It can be just a paragraph from an essay next to a translation from this, and the poems of mine. The next book of poems that's ready to go has a section in it in which I gather all the poems I wrote in connection with Celan. I obviously had early on, all of a sudden, to fight and say, hey, I can't let myself be taken over by Celan, right? So I wrote a sequence of poems that came out as a booklet called The Book of Luop Nalek. Luop Nalek is Paul Celan spelled backwards, right? And I created this nearly Blakean character, called Lwapnalek that I argue with, that I talk with, that And then I wrote a poem on his 100th birthday, kind of.
Okay.
I brought you over, the Black Earth, the Bukovina, we got Black Earth here too, and so on. But translation-wise, I may do a few things from North Africa. I may do a few things, as such, but no big projects. I have too many writing projects on my desk here, right in front of me.
Okay. Well, I think I can speak for all of us that we look forward to your projects that come up next, Pierre. Thank you very much for the conversation. Yeah. Carter, did you want to say something?
Thanks.
No, this has been great. And I really appreciate you, Pierre, being here to speak with us, and you, Nick, to speak with Pierre. I'll just mention that we do have a workshop with TETSI, the Toronto Experimental Translation Collective, coming up in probably the beginning of September, that we're excited to do, and that will focus on some of the Paul Celan poems and may include some of Pierre's work. So the applications for that will be available probably end of this week, beginning of next. So look out for that. But yeah, thank you both very much for this time tonight, and it's been a pleasure having you both.
Great, thanks, Carter. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you so much, Pierre.